the single biggest issue that we have is that we have made a huge decision to deglobalize, and that deglobalization has the risk of introducing a hyperinflation loop. And we won't know how bad that is for another year or two. Today, let's just say you buy a chip to make the iPhone. You buy that chip from, TSMC that makes it in Taiwan, ships it to China, and the entire world is serviced with that supply chain that keeps that chip as cheap as possible. Now, with the CHIPS Act as an example, we will build resilient supply chains where now instead of one place, it'll come from 6 places. 5 of those 6 will be in allied territories. The United States, Western Europe, potentially Mexico. The thing with that is that now is 6x more equipment that you're buying, right? Instead of one machine, you now have 6 machines. Instead of one person operating the machine in one country, you have 6 people in 6 countries. As you can imagine, when you layer up all these costs, there is no world in which that chip is as cheap as it was before. And so the cost of that has to be borne either by the consumer who pays a higher price, that's measured as inflation, or by the government who subsidizes it at the point of import, that'll be measured by debt. And so one way or the other, in our path now towards more resiliency and national security, which, by the way, I think is the absolute right decision, okay? Energy independence, all of this stuff we have to do today. We are at risk of a hyperinflationary loop if not managed well. And so you have to be really on the levers of the economy, and you have to understand it deeply. The person that deserves the most credit of preventing this hyperinflationary loop right now is Joe Manchin. And hopefully the history books, whatever Jay Powell does, I think has been good. But the fact that Manchin prevented $6 trillion more of being pumped into the economy in the last 2 years is probably the single thing that prevented inflation, instead of peaking at 9, from peaking at 15 or 16. I think it would have been a national disaster without that. Pressure was on Manchin to do the thing and see the forest from the trees, and he did that. There's one thing that allows us to solve all 3, if you bear with me for a second, and I think that is the energy independence of the United States. If you look inside of what's happening in the US today, the cost of generating energy is effectively as cheap as it's ever been and as close to zero as it ever has been, and it's only going to get cheaper. The problem that we have is that we have all of these decrepit laws and infrastructure and regulatory capture that causes us to always be in an imbalance. And as a result, we do all kinds of crazy things. We borrow enormous amounts of money to create subsidies. We go and we fight all of these, foreign wars that don't make any sense. We wrap the energy problem in setting climate change language, which causes this cultural division. But my belief, quite honestly, is that the reason the IRA was so important is as it is the most clarified piece of legislation we've seen that essentially puts all forms of energy on a level playing field and has the chance to get America to permanent energy independence. And if the cost of energy is zero and we can abundantly create it in the United States, what I think happens, David, is we have energy to rebuild our supply chain much cheaper, so inflation gets under control, we don't borrow as much. We have a completely different lens on foreign policy so that this interventionism and fighting over resources is much harder to justify. And we put the climate change language aside and we use energy independence as a form of national security, which gives us the courage to battle all these other cultural taboos that we otherwise have to say we agree with, even if they don't necessarily make any sense. And there's a bunch of them. I believe in nat gas. I believe in coal, actually, as a bridge fuel. I believe in all of these things. I believe that these are all more important than going off to all of these foreign lands and trying to justify spending trillions of dollars and putting tens of thousands of American lives at risk, essentially for resources that we can actually create for ourselves at home.